What's gaming, gamers? Today, I've got a build for you using the Shards of Galanor exotic arms armor for the Hunter. Shards of Galanor has the exotic perk Sharp Edges. Sharp Edges refund super energy based on how many enemies you hit or kill with the Blade Barrage projectiles, refunding up to a maximum of 50% of your super energy. If you use your Blade Barrage on a large group of adds, you're likely to get the full 50% super energy refunded, as well as if you hit a large boss with all of the Blade Barrage's projectiles. To get started with the build, I'll talk about the subclass's abilities, aspects, and fragments. Firstly, for your subclass, because this build uses Shards of Galanor, run the Blade Barrage Super. Shards of Galanor unfortunately doesn't work with either of the golden guns, as fun as that would be. For your abilities, I choose to run the Gambler's Dodge for the melee regeneration, although it's really your choice whether you'd like to run Gamblers or Marksman's. There's a case to be made for Acrobat's Dodge as well, but with this build in particular, you'll become Radiant in other ways and won't require the Acrobat's Dodge. For the melee ability, I run the Weighted Throwing Knife because I like the combat loop with it and the Gambler's Dodge, as well as its ability to instantly ignite any scorched target. But you could also run the Lightweight Knife. I'll talk more about that specific option when I go over the fragments shortly. For your grenade, you can run whichever grenade you like, although I recommend one of the damaging grenades over the healing grenade as you'll want to be scorching enemies. Onto aspects, firstly, run On Your Mark. This one is almost exclusively for the 3 fragment slots, but the increased handling and especially reload speed after getting a precision kill is a really nice passive buff. Secondly, run the Knock 'em Down aspect. This one will enhance your Blade Barrage by giving it more projectiles, thus more overall damage, as well as giving you 2 more fragment slots for a total of 5. One thing I'm not exactly sure of, however, is how Knock 'em Down affects the Shards of Galanor arms. If Shards of Galanor requires a certain number of Blade Barrage projectiles hit to refund super energy, then Knock 'em Down would just increase the chances of you getting the maximum 50% refunded super energy. However, if Shards of Galanor requires a certain percentage of Blade Barrage projectiles hit to refund super energy, then Knock 'em Down could negatively impact the amount of super energy you get when using your Blade Barrage on smaller bosses like Hive Wizards or Cabal Scions. If anyone has some insight into this, please let me know in the comments, as I'm not exactly sure how to test it. For your fragments, firstly, run Ember of Ashes. This will increase the amount of scorch stacks you apply to enemies, getting them closer to igniting. This also has the effect of increasing the amount of time it takes for their scorch stacks to deteriorate, allowing you more time to throw your weighted throwing knife at them to ignite them. The second fragment to run is Ember of Beams. This will give your Blade Barrage projectiles stronger target acquisition, which is to say the projectiles will curve their trajectories towards enemies more strongly than they would without Ember of Beams. This makes you more likely to get the maximum of 50% super energy refunded from your Shards of Galanor, as more projectiles are likely to hit the target you're aiming at. Ember of Beams also gives a plus 10 stat boost to intellect, but as you'll see when I go over the armor mods, this isn't important. The third fragment is Ember of Empyrean. This makes any solar weapon or ability final blow increase the duration of your radiant and restoration effects to their maximum, letting you theoretically infinitely chain the buffs until you run out of adds to kill. In practice, it's nowhere close to infinite, but because radiant increases the amount of damage your weapons do, increasing its duration increases your overall DPS. With how tanky endgame adds can be, especially melee enemies like Scorn Wraiths or Cabal Gladiators, the 25% damage buff from Radiant is really helpful for killing those threats before they can kill you themselves. The fourth fragment is Ember of Singeing. This will decrease the cooldown of your class ability when you scorch targets, getting your dodge back much more frequently to allow you to throw more throwing knives with Gambler's Dodge. If you're running a damaging grenade, you'll be scorching targets consistently, as well as if you're running an incandescent weapon or an exotic with Solar 3.0 synergy, but I'll talk more about weapons later in the video. The last fragment is where you can make a choice. If you're running the Weighted Throwing Knife, in this slot run Ember of Torches. This will lower your discipline stat by 10 points, but it makes you radiant whenever you hit an enemy with your Weighted Throwing Knife. This will give you the 25% damage buff to your weapons, and if you lose radiant by not getting kills to proc Ember of Empyrean, you can use your Gambler's Dodge, get another knife back, and become radiant once again. If you're running the Lightweight Knife instead of the Weighted Throwing Knife, you don't need Ember of Torches, as Lightweight Knife already makes you radiant when you get precision hits with it. It does require precision hits, but if you can hit those reliably with the knife, you can swap out Ember of Torches for Ember of Solace, increasing the duration of Radiant and getting rid of the minus 10 discipline from Ember of Torches. It's up to you which you want to run, but if you're looking for a prescriptive setup, I run the Weighted Throwing Knife and Ember of Torches, as I like the free extra damage from igniting scorched enemies when I hit them with the Weighted Throwing Knife. To recap the subclass build really quickly, run the Blade Barrage Super, your choice of dodge, your choice of jump, weighted or lightweight knife, your choice of damaging grenade, the On Your Mark aspect, the Knock 'em Down aspect, Ember of Ashes, Ember of Beams, Ember of Empyrean, Ember of Singeing, and either Ember of Torches or Ember of Solace. Onto your armor. For stats, firstly, spec into Resilience. This is the best stat in the game right now, as at tier 10 Resilience, you get a massive 40% damage reduction in all content, making you 40% more survivable than you would be at tier 0 Resilience. For secondary and tertiary stats, you can choose whichever you prefer. On a Hunter, mobility is always nice, and discipline will be good to continuously scorch enemies with your grenade. Don't spec into Intelligence, as you won't need to. For your armor's affinities, your helmet's affinity doesn't matter if you're running a solar weapon. If you're running an arc or void energy weapon, make your helmet that same element, otherwise you can save yourself the materials and leave it whatever affinity it is now, as there aren't any energy type specific mods slotted on the helmet. Your arms should be solar, but if you're mainly playing activities with champions, this doesn't matter as much. Your chest piece can be any affinity you want. Depending on the content you're doing, you can run the resistance mod for that specific energy type. Otherwise, if you have the seasonal resistance mod, which in Season of the Seraph is energy diffusion substrate, it isn't tied to a specific affinity and you can ignore what your chest piece's affinity is. For your legs, make these stasis, and for your class item, make it solar. Now to go over the mods you'll want equipped for your armor pieces. There are a couple options to what you can run, but I'll go over what I run first, and once I've gone over all the armor pieces and their mods, I'll explain the other options so you have context to them. Starting with your helmet, in the combat style slot, run a Font of Wisdom. Font of Wisdom increases your intellect to tier 10 for its duration, giving you maximum passive regeneration on your super. Intelligence doesn't affect how much super energy you regenerate from getting kills with weapons or from picking up orbs of power, but it will decrease the cooldown of your super, meaning you can get less kills and pick up less orbs of power than you would have to if you weren't running Font of Wisdom. Font of Wisdom is why you shouldn't spec into the intellect stat, as all of those stat points are wasted when Font of Wisdom maxes out your intellect just by picking up an elemental well. In the helmet specific slots, run 2 Harmonic Siphon mods. Normally, I'm an advocate for running a Harmonic Siphon and an Elemental Siphon mod, whether that be Arc, Solar, or Void. However, Harmonic Siphon stacks, making the Orb of Power drop more potent, giving you more super energy than you would get with 1 Harmonic Siphon and 1 Elemental Siphon mod. If your energy weapon isn't Solar and is instead Arc or Void, this is where you can change your helmet's affinity to match the damage type of your energy weapon and put on the Siphon mod that corresponds with it. Although I recommend running a Solar weapon here if at all possible, as an Arc or Void weapon won't proc Ember of Empyrean to increase the duration of your Radiant buff. On your solar arms, in the combat style slot, run another Font of Wisdom. By default, Font of Wisdom mods don't stack with each other, but we'll change that with one mod later on. In your arms specific slots, run an Impact Induction mod. This will decrease your grenade cooldown when dealing damage with a charged melee attack by 20% with one mod, or by 30% with 2 mods. I've only got 1 mod slotted, as I'm using the other 3 slots for a stat boost, but if you don't need the stat boost, you could run 2 Impact Inductions if you wanted. If you're in an activity with champions, however, you'll need the arm slots for champion mods, so you won't have the Impact Induction mod. On your chest piece, in the combat style slot, run yet another Font of Wisdom. Again, these will stack, but I'll talk more about that shortly. In the chest specific slots, run whichever resist mods you want. I run the seasonal resistance mod, but you can run whichever mods make the most sense for the content you're playing. For your stasis legs, in the combat style slot, run Elemental Time Dilation. This is what will allow Font of Wisdom to stack with itself, giving you extra duration for the buff based on how many Font of Wisdom mods you have equipped. 1 Font of Wisdom paired with Elemental Time Dilation will last around 35 seconds, 2 will increase the buff to around 40 seconds, and 3 will increase it even further to around 45 seconds. In the leg specific slots, run an Absolution and an Orb of Restoration mod. These will give you ability energy when picking up Orbs of Power, and you'll be creating orbs with the Harmonic Siphon mods in your helmet. Alternatively, you can run a Scavenger mod for ammo if you'd like, but that's personal preference. Lastly, on your Solar Cloak, in the Combat Style mod, run an Elemental Armaments mod. This is what will spawn your Solar Elemental Wells to proc Font of Wisdom. Elemental Armaments has about a 10% chance to spawn an Elemental Well on kill, so long as the weapon killing the enemy's energy type matches your subclass element. This leads to you spawning an Elemental Well on average every 8 kills, and with the 3 Font of Wisdom mods you have on, you'll be reprocking Font of Wisdom before it runs out in most cases. In the class item specific slots, run 2 Bomber mods. These will grant you grenade energy when using your dodge, which you'll be using often to get your knife back anyways, so the free grenade energy is nice. If you don't care to slot all of these armor mods yourself, I'll leave a Destiny Item Manager link to the build in the description, so check that out if you'd like. Now that I've gone over what I run for armor mods, there are some other decisions you can make to change up the build how you like. The biggest decision revolves around the Font of Wisdom mods. Because 1 Font of Wisdom gives you 35 seconds of max intelligence, and the subsequent 2nd and 3rd Font of Wisdom mods only give you 40 and 45 seconds respectively, if you think the 40 or 45 seconds are overkill, you can remove 1 or 2 of the Font of Wisdom mods and replace them with Font of Might. These will give your solar weapons extra damage for 13 seconds with 1 Font of Might equipped, or 16 seconds with 2 Font of Mights equipped. If you don't want Font of Wisdom at all, that's also perfectly acceptable. Running a 3rd Font of Might mod will increase the solar weapon boost buff to 20 seconds. The exact configuration of Font of Might and Font of Wisdom is entirely up to you. It's something you should play around with and get a feel for yourself. Personally, I'm either running 3 Font of Wisdoms or 2 Font of Wisdoms and 1 Font of Might. It really depends on how I'm feeling and what content I'm doing. Onto the weapons, as there are some options for what you can run. I'll go over the energy slot first, as the kinetic slot's weapon isn't really worth talking about. You should be running a solar weapon in the energy slot. It will give you extra damage if you're running Font of Might, and only solar weapons will proc elemental armaments to summon wells for you. If you're only running Font of Wisdom, and you want to run an Arc or a Void weapon, you can forego one of your bomber mods on your class item and swap the elemental armaments mod for a melee well maker. Or you can just swap elemental armaments for elemental ordnance, but those both rely on your abilities getting kills, and in late game content I find that it can be hard for me to get kills with abilities consistently. As far as what specific weapons you can run here, any weapon that's solar will do the job. If you want an exotic, some of my favorites are Tiku's Divination, Taraba, Skyburner's Oath, Merciless, Polaris Lance, and the new bow from the Spire of the Watcher dungeon, Hierarchy of Needs. For legendary weapons, my favorites include the Callus Minitool SMG, the Strident Whistle Bow, the Trustee Scout Rifle, the Vision of Confluence Scout Rifle, the Zali's Bane Hand Cannon, and the BXR-55 Battler Pulse Rifle. Any weapon with Incandescent or an exotic that applies Scorch will be the best, as it will proc Ember of Singeing and regenerate your class ability faster. Even if you don't have Incandescent, your grenade will still scorch enemies, so don't worry too much about making sure you have Incandescent, and and try different things. Any one of the weapons I just mentioned will do a fantastic job in all content, especially if it has a seasonal anti-champion mod. Speaking of champions, I got a comment on my Lorelei Splendor Titan video asking about how to deal with champions when the mods on these builds are pretty set. And the answer to that is that the mods aren't set. You can change any of the mods you'd like, mess around with it, and see what works best for you. If you're playing content with champions, what I do is run a weapon with intrinsic anti-champion capabilities like Bastion, the all-powerful Arbalest, Wishender, Malfeasance, or Revision Zero, and remove one of the impact induction mods from the arms to slot in a seasonal anti-champion mod. If I need Overload, I put in an Overload mod and run a Solar Scout Rifle, SMG, or Auto Rifle. If I need Barrier, I slot in a Barrier mod and run a Solar Bow or Pulse Rifle. If I need Unstoppable, I sock in an Unstoppable Hand Cannon mod and run a Solar Hand Cannon. These are changes that you can make, and indeed have to make when working with enemies like champions or match game shields, and it's perfectly fine to adapt the build to play around enemies like that. Don't be afraid to experiment. There's not much to talk about with heavy weapons, other than to say that if you can, run a solar one. Anything solar will work, as it will benefit from the increased damage of Font of Might, but if you're running Nightfall Strikes and it's Void or Arc Burn, you can run an Arc or Void heavy weapon and it will still benefit from Radiant. Now that I've talked about weapons, I can move on to the playstyle for the build and explain how to play it effectively. Firstly, be getting hits with your knife to proc Radiant, as it will give you a 25% boost to weapon damage and will help you get rapid kills on enemies in late game content to proc the Harmonic Siphon mods in your helmet and summon Orbs of Power. Pick up as many of these orbs as you can, along with any elemental wells that drop, and continue that loop. Hit enemies with your melee ability to become Radiant, kill enemies, pick up orbs and elemental wells. Once you've got your super, you can choose how to use it, whether that be on a boss or in a large group of ads. Neither is objectively better, that's your decision to make in the moment. Just make sure if it's a boss, you're hitting as many of the Blade Barrage projectiles as you can. Bosses like Cabal Scions and Hive Wizards are probably not the best option at Blade Barrage, as the majority of projectiles will miss due to the boss's small hitbox, and you want your Shards of Galanor to get up to its 50% maximum super energy refund. Depending on the boss fight, the ad density, and your ability to keep your buffs up, you can have your super up for damage phases and fully regenerated during immune phases. And that's all for the build. Thanks for watching, and I really appreciate the support I've gotten on my previous videos. Comment if you end up using the build and have any ideas or criticisms. I appreciate any constructive feedback. I'll be back next week with another Titan build. Subscribe if you want to be notified when that goes live. Have a good day.